Amber Gibson's childhood, marked by hardship, provided her with a unique perspective on life, one shaped by both love and loss, strength and vulnerability. Born in Scotland, Amber came into a family that, while full of potential for warmth and connection, was burdened by the weight of emotional and personal struggles. Her parents, despite their deep love for their children, struggled with addiction, mental health challenges, and personal trauma that made it difficult for them to provide Amber and her younger brother Connor with the stability they desperately needed. As a young child, Amber was particularly close to Connor, who was a few years younger than her. Their bond, though affected by the turbulence around them, was a constant source of support for both siblings. Amber took on a maternal role in their relationship, often looking out for him, comforting him when their environment felt chaotic, and sharing her dreams of a better life. Despite their circumstances, the Gibson siblings shared a closeness that would shape their lives in profound ways. However, it wasn't long before Amber's home life became more unstable. The combination of her parents' difficulties, financial hardship, and the emotional toll of growing up in an environment filled with conflict led to Amber being placed into foster care. She was just a child when this transition occurred, one of many children who would come to experience the foster care system. For Amber, this shift would mark a dramatic change in her life and, in many ways, shape who she became as a person. Foster care, while offering the promise of safety and a fresh start, often came with its own set of challenges. Amber found herself placed in several different homes over the years, some better than others. Each time, she hoped for a sense of stability, a feeling of being loved and wanted. Unfortunately, the transient nature of foster care often left Amber feeling like an outsider. No matter where she went, she never quite felt like she truly belonged. Though Amber formed some connections during her time in foster care, the lack of permanence in these relationships affected her deeply. She often felt alone, trapped between worlds, the world of her biological family, which she still longed for, and the world of her foster families, where she struggled to fit in. As a teenager, Amber began to show signs of emotional turmoil, grappling with feelings of rejection, abandonment, and the deep yearning for something more stable and secure. Despite these emotional challenges, Amber remained a survivor. She was resourceful, independent, and determined to make something of herself. She attended school, where she was known for her wit and charm. Amber's friends would later recall her as someone who could brighten even the darkest days with her infectious smile. She was the type of person who could be counted on in times of need, the one who would stand by others, even when she herself was struggling. But the emotional scars from her childhood weren't easy to overcome. As a young adult, Amber continued to wrestle with the ghosts of her past, searching for meaning and purpose in her life. She dreamed of leaving behind the chaos and uncertainty of her earlier years. She wanted to find peace, to create a future that was entirely her own, a future where she could put the broken pieces of her past together and make something beautiful from them. Amber's hope for a better future wasn't just about escaping her past, it was about finding a sense of belonging. She longed for the stability that had eluded her for so long. Despite her struggles, Amber had an innate sense of optimism that drove her forward. She had dreams of building a family of her own, of having a career she could be proud of, and of finding love and acceptance in a world that had often been unkind to her. At the heart of Amber's story was her relationship with her family, particularly with Connor. The siblings' bond remained a source of strength for both of them, even though their lives had taken dramatically different paths. As Amber navigated the difficulties of foster care and struggled with her mental health, she remained deeply connected to Connor. Their relationship, though strained at times by the complexities of their shared past, was a testament to the resilience of familial love. However, as Amber grew older, she would come to realize that sometimes the people we love most can also become the source of our deepest pain. In many ways, Amber's story was one of constant striving for a sense of security, for love, and for a life that was free from the shadows of her past. She was a young woman with dreams that were grounded in the hope of finding happiness, peace, and fulfillment. Tragically, the path she was on would be interrupted, and those dreams would never come to fruition. In the days leading up to Amber Gibson's murder, there was a sense of normalcy in her life, though perhaps normal is not the right word for someone who had experienced so much instability. But for Amber, things appeared to be progressing in a direction that she hoped would lead to stability. She had been living in Hamilton, Scotland, and was focused on her personal growth, taking care of herself and maintaining her relationship with her family, particularly her brother, Connor. However, as the days passed, there were signs that Amber's life was beginning to unravel in ways that she could not control. While she had dreams of a better future, her past, her troubled relationship with her family, the trauma of growing up in foster care, and the mental health struggles she had battled for years, was beginning to catch up with her. Amber had a history of emotional turmoil, but she had always found a way to press forward. Yet, in her final days, it seemed as though the weight of her past and present struggles was growing too heavy to bear. On the evening of November 26, 2021, Amber spent time with her friends and family. She was described as being in good spirits, though some of those close to her noticed that she had been more withdrawn in the days leading up to her disappearance. Amber had recently had a confrontation with her brother, Connor, and there were tensions in their relationship. While Connor was often seen as a protector of Amber, it appeared that, in the days before her death, their bond was fraying. However, no one could have predicted the catastrophic event that would occur soon after. Amber was last seen alive on the evening of November 26th, when she told friends she was heading home after a night out. She had been out for a brief period, but something about her departure seemed off. According to the timeline of events, Amber did not make it back to her apartment that night. She never returned to her flat, and it wasn't long before the alarm was raised. At first, those closest to her assumed that she might have simply gone off with friends or gotten distracted, but the hours turned into days, and concern began to grow. The next day, Amber's disappearance was reported to the police. Her family, friends, and community were left in a state of confusion and fear. It was out of character for Amber to simply vanish without a word, and there was an overwhelming sense that something had gone horribly wrong. The search for Amber intensified, and police began their investigation. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Amber's death was not a random act. On November 30th, 2021, her body was found in woodland near the town of Hamilton, not far from where she had last been seen. The discovery of Amber's body was a devastating blow to her family, friends, and the community. It confirmed the worst fears of those who had been searching for her. The investigation into her murder was swift and thorough. It didn't take long for authorities to focus on Connor Gibson, Amber's own brother, as a key figure in the case. In the days following the discovery of Amber's body, detectives pieced together disturbing details about her final hours. Forensic evidence revealed that Amber had suffered blunt force trauma to her body and had been sexually assaulted before her death. The brutality of her murder shocked everyone who knew her, and the circumstances of her death led investigators to question whether someone close to her had been involved. Connor Gibson was arrested and charged with his sister's murder. It was a revelation that stunned not only the public, but also those who had known the siblings. The notion that someone who had been so close to Amber, the person who had been her confidant, her protector, and her family, could have been the one to take her life, was almost incomprehensible. The police investigation revealed that Amber and Connor had been in close contact in the days leading up to her death. On the evening of her disappearance, it was revealed that Amber had been in communication with Connor, and there were indications of a heated argument between the two. The exact nature of their dispute was unclear, but it seemed to have been a tipping point. It was later revealed that Connor had been struggling with his own personal demons, including issues with mental health and addiction, which may have played a role in the events leading up to Amber's tragic death. Connor Gibson's arrest marked the beginning of a complex and heartbreaking trial that would unfold in the months to come. His defense team would argue that he had not intended to kill his sister, claiming that the act had been unplanned and born out of a moment of intense emotional distress. But for the community and Amber's family, the loss of the young woman who had so much potential was not something that could easily be understood or accepted. On November 30th, 2021, just a few days after Amber had been reported missing, the search for her intensified. The police, along with volunteers from the local community, scoured the area in and around Hamilton, Scotland, hoping for any sign of Amber. It was a tense and anxious time, as every hour that passed without finding her made the situation feel increasingly grim. After several days of searching, Amber's body was discovered by police in a wooded area near Hamilton. The discovery came as a shock to her family, who had clung to hope that Amber would be found alive, albeit perhaps disoriented or in some form of distress. But the news that her body had been found confirmed the worst fears of her loved ones. The area where her body was located was not far from where Amber had last been seen, and it was a place that had not initially been searched thoroughly. The location where Amber's body was found was key to the investigation. The wooded area, although relatively close to her home, was not easily visible or accessible, which made it a place where Amber might have been hidden in the aftermath of her death. The circumstances surrounding her body's discovery suggested that Amber had been deliberately placed in the area, which immediately raised suspicions about the possibility of foul play. The discovery of Amber's body was followed by an immediate police response. A full forensic investigation was launched, and police began to examine every detail surrounding the discovery. Forensic experts worked tirelessly to gather evidence that could shed light on the cause of death and the circumstances leading to her murder. As part of the investigation, forensic teams examined Amber's body for signs of trauma and other clues that could indicate the manner of her death. It quickly became clear that Amber had suffered significant injuries. She had sustained blunt force trauma to her head and other parts of her body. This was a key detail in the investigation because it indicated that Amber had been attacked and likely murdered. In addition to the physical injuries, forensic experts found signs of sexual assault. The combination of these findings pointed to a brutal and violent attack on Amber in the moments leading up to her death. This was a shocking revelation for Amber's family and friends, who could not comprehend why anyone, let alone a family member, would want to harm her in such a horrific way. The autopsy also provided more insight into the timeline of Amber's death. The evidence indicated that she had been killed within a short time frame after her last known sighting, which helped narrow down the window in which the murder had occurred. This was a crucial piece of information, as it allowed investigators to focus on the specific period when Amber had gone missing and who might have been involved in the events leading up to her death. Once Amber's body was found, the investigation into her murder began in earnest. Detectives reviewed Amber's recent interactions with friends, family, and acquaintances, looking for any possible leads or clues that might explain why she had been killed. The more they dug into Amber's life, the more troubling details emerged. The police began by focusing on those closest to Amber, including her family members. The relationship between Amber and her brother, Connor, became an area of intense scrutiny. Amber's family and friends had described Connor as a protective figure in her life, someone who had been there for her during difficult times. However, in the days leading up to Amber's death, there had been signs of strain in their relationship. They had reportedly argued, and Amber had seemed withdrawn in her last conversations with loved ones. Connor was one of the last people to have seen Amber alive, and investigators began to look closely at their interactions. The police gathered phone records and digital evidence to trace Amber's final moments, and it quickly became apparent that she had been in contact with Connor on the night of her disappearance. Text messages and phone calls indicated that their communication had been tense, and the last contact between the siblings had been an argument. As the investigation deepened, police also learned about Connor's own personal struggles. He had a history of mental health issues and had been known to struggle with anger management. These factors began to paint a troubling picture of his involvement in the crime. Despite his previous role as Amber's protector, it appeared that something had gone terribly wrong between the two siblings in the days leading up to her death. On December 2, 2021, just days after Amber's body was discovered, Amber Gibson was arrested in connection with his sister's murder. His arrest sent shockwaves through the community, as many could not fathom that someone so close to Amber, someone who had been a part of her life for so long, could be responsible for such a heinous crime. During questioning, Connor initially denied any involvement in his sister's death, but as the evidence against him mounted, his story began to change. Police had gathered substantial evidence, including forensic details, phone records, and witness statements that linked him to the scene of the crime. Connor's arrest marked the beginning of what would become a lengthy legal process, with many questions still remaining about his motives and the exact sequence of events leading to Amber's murder. The arrest of Connor Gibson was a pivotal moment in the investigation. It confirmed the fears of those close to Amber. Her death was not the result of a random act of violence, but a calculated and brutal attack by someone she trusted and loved. The emotional toll on Amber's family was overwhelming, as they now had to come to terms with the fact that one of their own was responsible for her murder. The arrest of Connor Gibson garnered significant media attention, with the case becoming a focal point in both local and national news. The details of Amber's death, particularly the revelation that her brother had been involved, shocked the public. Many people were left grappling with the idea that a family member could be capable of such a crime. The media coverage was relentless, with reporters closely following every development in the case. The media coverage also brought attention to the issue of domestic violence, mental health, and the complexities of familial relationships. As the investigation progressed, many began to question what might have driven Connor to commit such an unimaginable act. Was it a result of a long-standing emotional issue? Was it the culmination of years of pent-up frustration and unresolved trauma? These questions became central to the public discourse surrounding the case. The arrest of Connor Gibson marked the turning point in the investigation into the murder of his sister, Amber Gibson. It was a moment that stunned not only their family and friends but the entire community, as the police unveiled a truth that many found difficult to accept. The man responsible for Amber's brutal death was, in fact, her own brother. This section of the investigation details the lead-up to his arrest, the police's efforts to gather evidence, the process of his questioning, and the implications of his arrest on both his family and the broader public. From the outset of the investigation, Connor Gibson had been on the radar of law enforcement, as he was one of the last people known to have seen Amber alive. The siblings' relationship was one of the first areas of focus for detectives, who spoke to friends and family to try to piece together what had happened in the days leading up to Amber's disappearance. Witnesses reported seeing Connor and Amber together, and while some accounts described him as a protective older brother, there were also reports that hinted at tension between them. Amber had confided in friends about feeling upset and distanced from Connor, and there were reports of arguments between them, which raised suspicions among those closest to Amber. This tension became especially critical after the discovery of Amber's body. Police began to analyze Amber's phone records, which revealed that she had been in contact with Connor in the hours before her disappearance. These records showed a series of exchanges, some of which were increasingly fraught. The last known communication between the two siblings occurred shortly before Amber's disappearance, and this was crucial. Investigators wondered, was it a typical sibling argument, or had something more sinister occurred in that final interaction? Detectives began to dig deeper into Connor's past, and as they gathered more information, the picture became even more complicated. Connor had a history of mental health struggles, which included anger issues and erratic behavior at times. This raised red flags for the police, especially as they began to consider whether these underlying issues could have contributed to Amber's death. His personal struggles, combined with his proximity to Amber during the critical time frame, painted a troubling portrait. As the investigation unfolded, forensic evidence became a key factor in Connor's arrest. Police conducted a thorough examination of Amber's body, looking for signs of violence that might indicate the manner of her death. The injuries Amber sustained, blunt force trauma to the head and other parts of her body, were consistent with a violent attack. There were also indications of sexual assault, which added another layer of complexity and horror to the case. Further analysis of Connor's digital footprint was crucial in establishing his connection to the crime. Police seized his mobile phone and examined the contents, including messages, calls, and location data. The phone records provided damning evidence. Not only did they reveal the tense nature of the final exchanges between Connor and Amber, but they also placed Connor in the area where Amber's body was eventually found. GPS tracking data from Connor's phone placed him in the vicinity of the wooded area where Amber's body was discovered. This discovery was significant because it suggested that Connor had been near the scene at a time that aligned with the window of Amber's death. Moreover, there were inconsistencies in Connor's alibi, and he had been unable to explain his whereabouts convincingly. This mounting evidence provided investigators with the information they needed to move forward with his arrest. On December 2, 2021, after a series of interviews and an accumulation of both forensic and digital evidence, police made the decision to arrest Connor Gibson on suspicion of murder. The arrest was the culmination of days of intense investigation and growing evidence pointing directly to him. Connor was taken into custody in a carefully planned operation. The arrest was carried out without incident, and Connor did not resist, although his emotional state was reportedly unstable. His arrest shocked many, including those who had known him well. To the outside world, Connor had been a supportive older brother, but the dark reality behind the public facade was now beginning to emerge. The shock and grief that swept through Amber's family, as well as the larger community, were overwhelming. Connor's family, especially his mother, were devastated by the news. While they had hoped for Amber's safe return, the idea that one of their own could be responsible for such a brutal act was beyond comprehension. The arrest forced family members to confront the uncomfortable reality that someone they loved had committed an unimaginable crime. After his arrest, Connor was questioned by detectives. During the initial stages of questioning, Connor denied any involvement in Amber's death, insisting that he had no idea what had happened to her. However, as the interview progressed, detectives presented him with the overwhelming evidence they had gathered: phone records, GPS data, and forensic findings. The mounting evidence made it increasingly difficult for Connor to maintain his innocence. At one point during the interrogation, Connor became emotional and began to offer a series of inconsistent statements. His denials faltered, and his responses to questions became more erratic as the pressure mounted. Connor's reaction to the questioning was troubling, as he seemed to fluctuate between claiming ignorance about the situation and offering vague explanations for his actions. Investigators noted the significant psychological toll that the process seemed to take on him, but they also recognized that the evidence against him was undeniable. Connor's legal team was eventually contacted, and the nature of his responses and behavior during questioning would later play a significant role in his trial. The interrogation would be scrutinized closely in the courtroom, as it highlighted the psychological state of the defendant and raised questions about his mental health at the time of Amber's death. The arrest of Connor Gibson had far-reaching emotional and legal consequences. For Amber's family, it was a moment of painful realization that their beloved daughter and sister had been taken from them not by a stranger, but by someone they had trusted. The grief was compounded by the trauma of the arrest. Amber's death was already an unimaginable tragedy, but the idea that her own brother had been responsible added another layer of complexity to the emotional landscape. The public reaction to the arrest was similarly mixed. While many expressed disbelief and shock, others began to speculate about the reasons behind Connor's alleged actions. In the weeks that followed, media coverage of the case would delve into the background of both Amber and Connor, seeking to explain what had led to such a tragic and violent outcome. From a legal standpoint, Connor's arrest was the beginning of a long process that would culminate in his trial. The case was a difficult one for prosecutors, who had to present a compelling argument that a brother had murdered his sister. The emotional weight of the case would weigh heavily on everyone involved, and the trial would be a painful and public process for the Gibson family. The trial began months after Connor Gibson's arrest in 2021, and the proceedings were set to unfold in a high-profile courtroom battle. The charges against Connor were serious: the premeditated murder of his sister, Amber. The prosecution was determined to secure a conviction, while the defense mounted a strategy aimed at casting doubt on the allegations, particularly focusing on Connor's mental state at the time of the crime. The courtroom was filled with tension as members of Amber's family, along with the general public, attended the hearings. The emotional weight of the case was palpable. Family members, particularly Amber's mother and father, had to sit through a trial that would bring all the painful details of their daughter's final days to the forefront. The emotional toll on the family was unimaginable, but they were determined to see justice served for Amber. The prosecution's case against Connor Gibson was built on a combination of forensic evidence, digital footprints, and witness testimony. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence was the forensic analysis of Amber's body. Autopsy reports revealed the horrific nature of her death. Amber had suffered blunt force trauma to her head and other parts of her body, with additional signs of sexual assault. This confirmed that Amber had not died quickly, but rather had endured a violent attack. The prosecution argued that these injuries pointed to a deliberate and brutal act, and they contended that Connor had been the perpetrator. They presented evidence that Connor had been in the area where Amber's body was found, as confirmed by GPS data from his phone. This information placed him near the scene during the window of time in which Amber's murder occurred. Furthermore, phone records showed that Connor had been in contact with Amber shortly before she was last seen, and the tone of their interactions suggested escalating tension. Another key piece of evidence was the timeline of events leading up to Amber's death. According to the prosecution, Connor had not been forthcoming about his whereabouts on the night Amber died. Witnesses who had seen Connor and Amber together reported that their relationship had been strained, which further fueled the prosecution's theory of motive. While there was no clear indication of a specific trigger for the murder, the prosecution painted a picture of a brother who had snapped after a volatile argument. In addition to forensic and digital evidence, the prosecution also called several key witnesses. These included friends of Amber, who described the emotional distance she had been experiencing from her brother in the weeks before her death. They testified that Amber had confided in them about her brother's behavior, which made it all the more heartbreaking for those who had known her well. They recalled how Amber had often expressed concern about the. In contrast, the defense team for Connor Gibson sought to challenge the evidence presented by the prosecution and create doubt in the minds of the jury. They argued that while Connor had been in the area where Amber's body was found, this did not prove that he was the one who killed her. The defense pointed out that there were no eyewitnesses to the crime, and the circumstantial evidence alone was not enough to convict him. The defense also focused heavily on Connor's mental health. They presented evidence that Connor had struggled with significant psychological issues, including depression and anger management problems. According to the defense, Connor had been dealing with feelings of isolation, stress, and emotional turmoil leading up to Amber's death. They argued that he had not planned the murder, but had instead acted out of a momentary loss of control triggered by a dispute with his sister. The defense also pointed to Connor's emotional state during the interrogation and questioning process. They suggested that Connor's erratic behavior and contradictory statements were a result of his mental health struggles and not an indication of guilt. They contended that Connor's unstable emotional state at the time of his sister's death should be considered when evaluating his actions. While the defense acknowledged that the evidence against Connor was strong, they hoped to cast doubt on the prosecution's assertion that the crime was premeditated. Instead, they argued that the murder had been a tragic, impulsive act, driven by a combination of stress, unresolved family issues, and Connor's mental health problems. Given the defense's emphasis on Connor's mental health, expert testimony played a significant role in the trial. Forensic psychologists were brought in to evaluate Connor's psychological state at the time of Amber's death. These experts testified that Connor had a history of mental health issues, including depression and anger issues, which may have contributed to his emotional instability at the time of the crime. The prosecution, however, presented their own experts who countered the defense's arguments. They argued that while Connor's mental health was certainly a factor in his behavior, it did not excuse his actions or explain the brutality of the murder. They emphasized that the evidence pointed to a calculated and violent attack, rather than a spur-of-the-moment loss of control. One of the most significant pieces of expert testimony came from a forensic psychologist who stated that the injuries inflicted on Amber were indicative of someone who had acted with intention. The psychologist explained that the level of violence involved suggested premeditation and a deliberate decision to harm Amber, rather than an impulsive outburst. This expert testimony was key in refuting the defense's argument that Connor had acted without planning. Throughout the trial, the emotional impact on those involved was immense. Amber's family was present every day, forced to endure the painful details of their daughter's final moments. The family's grief was compounded by the realization that Connor was the one responsible for her death. For them, the trial was a painful journey toward understanding what had happened, but it also served as a form of catharsis as they sought justice for Amber. For Connor, the trial was a harrowing experience. His defense attorneys worked to portray him as a deeply troubled individual, and there were moments during the trial when he appeared visibly distressed. The weight of the accusations, the pressure of the legal proceedings, and the personal nature of the case were evident in his behavior, and the public scrutiny added to the emotional toll he was facing. The trial also had a profound impact on the community. Many people had known the Gibson family, and the revelation that Amber's own brother had killed her was a devastating shock. The case raised questions about family dynamics, mental health, and the capacity for violence within seemingly normal family relationships. After weeks of testimony and legal arguments, the trial came to an end. The jury deliberated carefully, weighing the evidence and considering the arguments made by both the prosecution and defense. The emotional burden of the case weighed heavily on the jurors, who knew that their decision would have lasting consequences for both Connor and his family, as well as for Amber's loved ones. Ultimately, the jury found Connor Gibson guilty of the murder of Amber Gibson. The verdict was a painful but necessary step toward justice. The conviction brought some closure to Amber's family, though it did little to ease the pain of their loss. For Connor, the guilty verdict marked the end of a long legal battle, but it was also a reminder of the irrevocable harm he had caused. The trial of Connor Gibson left an indelible mark on everyone involved, and it served as a somber reminder of the devastating consequences of violence within families. The emotional and psychological complexities of the case, combined with the brutal nature of Amber's death, made it one of the most tragic and heart-wrenching cases to come out of Scotland in recent years.